In December 1912, a British amateur archaeologist named Charles Dawson unveiled a set of skull fragments he said had been dug from a gravel pit in Piltdown, a small village in rural Sussex, England. Bones he claimed belonged to a creature unlike anything scientists had ever found, a human skull paired with an ape-like jaw, the long-sought missing link between apes and modern humans. For more than 40 years, a large part of the British scientific establishment believed him completely. It was a lie from the very beginning. Piltdown Man wasn't a fossil at all. It was a deliberately assembled fake, a modern human skull combined with the filed-down jawbone of an orangutan, both artificially stained to look tens of thousands of years old, and it fooled some of the most respected paleontologists and anatomists in Britain for over 4 decades. Charles Dawson was a country solicitor and enthusiastic amateur fossil hunter, well known and well liked in scientific circles for years of genuine minor discoveries he donated to museums. He had no formal scientific training, no university post, and, by his own account, a burning desire to be recognized as a serious scientist before he died. In 1912, he got his wish and set British anthropology on the wrong path for a generation. By 1912, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution had been broadly accepted by scientists for over 50 years, but one enormous piece of the puzzle was still missing. Nobody had found a fossil that clearly bridged the gap between ape ancestors and modern humans. Fossils of early humans had been found in France, Germany, and Indonesia, but Britain had none of its own, a source of real professional embarrassment for British scientists competing on the international stage. Dawson brought his find to Arthur Smith Woodward, the highly respected keeper of geology at the Natural History Museum in London, who was thrilled by what he saw. Together they announced Eoanthropus dawsoni, Dawson's Dawn Man, to the Geological Society of London in December 1912, presenting a skull that appeared to combine an unmistakably human-sized brain case with a distinctly primitive ape-like jaw. The find was exactly what British science had been hoping for, proof that humanity's earliest ancestors had evolved a large brain first, before other physical traits caught up, and proof that one of the earliest examples had been found on English soil. Skepticism existed from the very beginning among a handful of anatomists who thought the jaw and skull looked suspiciously like they came from 2 different animals entirely. But those doubts were largely dismissed or ignored. Piltdown Man was added to textbooks, museum displays, and evolutionary charts across Britain and beyond. Nobody thought to test whether the bones were actually as old as they looked. For decades, Piltdown Man's status only grew more secure. In 1915, Dawson announced a second similar find nearby, quickly nicknamed Piltdown 2, which conveniently silenced most remaining skeptics, since it seemed unlikely that 2 separate hoaxes would produce such similar results in 2 different locations. Dawson died the following year in 1916, having achieved the scientific recognition he had spent his life chasing and was never seriously investigated while he was alive. Generations of British students were taught that the earliest humans evolved big brains before anything else changed. A narrative shaped directly by Piltdown Man, even as fossil discoveries elsewhere in the world, including finds in South Africa and China, increasingly suggested the opposite evolutionary sequence. That upright walking came first, brain size later. For years, many British scientists dismissed those contradicting discoveries, partly because they didn't fit the picture Piltdown had already established. It wasn't until after the Second World War that new scientific tools finally caught up to the 50-year-old mystery. In the early 1950s, a young paleontologist named Kenneth Oakley developed a chemical dating technique that measured how much fluorine had accumulated in buried bone over time. The longer bone sits in the ground, the more fluorine it typically absorbs. Oakley decided to finally test the Piltdown remains directly, alongside colleagues Wilfred LeGros Clark and Joseph Weiner. What they found didn't just cast doubt on Piltdown Man, it ended it completely. The fluorine tests came back showing the skull and jaw contained barely any fluorine at all, meaning neither piece was anywhere near the hundreds of thousands of years old that had been claimed. Closer physical inspection under magnification revealed even more damning evidence. The teeth in the jawbone had been deliberately filed down with a metal tool to mimic the flat wear pattern of a human diet, and file marks were still visible under a microscope. The bones themselves had been artificially stained with iron salts and a chemical called chromic acid to match the dark color of genuinely ancient fossils from the local gravel bed. The jaw, it turned out, wasn't from any ancient human ancestor at all. It belonged to an orangutan, likely one purchased from an ordinary natural history dealer, combined with the skull of an entirely modern human, probably no more than a few hundred years old, and buried together at the Piltdown site specifically to be discovered. On November 21, 1953, Oakley, Weiner, and LeGros Clark published their findings in the journal Nature. The verdict was blunt and unambiguous. Piltdown Man was an elaborate, deliberate forgery, assembled by someone with real anatomical knowledge and real patience, and it had successfully deceived the scientific establishment for more than 40 years. The only remaining question was who had done it, and for decades afterward, that question would prove almost as difficult to answer as the fake fossil had been to expose. Suspicion fell overwhelmingly on Charles Dawson himself, the one person present at every stage of every discovery, with documented access to both the burial site and, through his legal and antiquarian work, plausible means of acquiring an orangutan jaw and ancient-looking stained bones. Other names were floated over the years, including Arthur Smith Woodward and even the young geologist and philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who had been present at some of the digs as a student. But no solid evidence ever implicated anyone beyond Dawson. A comprehensive scientific review in 2016, examining DNA and tool markings across the Piltdown specimens with modern forensic techniques, concluded that all the fabricated evidence bore the signature of a single hoaxer using a consistent method and a limited set of materials, strongly pointing to Dawson working alone, likely driven by his long-documented ambition to be recognized as a great scientist rather than a well-connected hobbyist. The damage to British and international paleontology, though, had already been done. For over 40 years, an entire generation of anthropologists had built theories, taught students, and interpreted genuine fossil discoveries elsewhere in the world through the distorting lens of a fake. The Piltdown affair became one of the most cited case studies in the history of science for exactly how professional expertise, national pride, and the desire to see a theory confirmed can override basic scientific skepticism, for decades, from people who should have known better. Today, the Piltdown Man fragments are kept at the Natural History Museum in London, no longer displayed as evidence of human evolution, but as an artifact of scientific history in their own right, a permanent reminder of how the hoax happened and why it worked for as long as it did. The pub in the village of Piltdown itself was even renamed the Piltdown Man, in honor of, and in on the joke about, the town's strange claim to fame. Charles Dawson never lived to see his creation exposed, having died decades before Kenneth Oakley's fluorine tests finally caught up with him. Whatever recognition he was chasing, he got it. Just not the kind he wanted. Remembered now not as the man who found humanity's missing link, but as the man who successfully faked it for over 40 years. The Piltdown Man hoax remains one of the longest-running deceptions in scientific history, not because the forgery itself was flawless, but because it told scientists exactly what they were already hoping to hear. Sometimes the easiest lie to believe is the one that confirms what you wanted to be true all along. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.